Great, we're ready to start. We've started recording. I'm going to give a brief overview as to why we're doing this video. But first, if you all could introduce yourselves. Go ahead, Sarah.
Sarah.
All right. I'm Sarah Wheeler, and I'm studying emotional intelligence. I've been in school for a while now, and I really enjoy learning about this topic, especially as it relates to interpreting, but more than that, how it relates to people. And I'm with these two brilliant people, so I'm so excited to get this opportunity to talk about this and learn about this a little bit more with you guys.
Where are those people?
Are we
Oh,
expecting
wait.
someone else?
No. They're supposed to join later.
Oh, you're not alone in the room. Gotcha. Got it.
Why don't you go ahead, John?
Hi, I'm John. My parents are deaf. I've been an interpreter for quite some time, and I just really have an ongoing curiosity about what makes interpreters grow, regress, self-assess, and analyze other interpreters.
Great. Thank you for your introductions. I'm Ryan Commerson. And my overall goal is to elevate and improve both the deaf community and the interpreting communities through dialogue with several kinds of analyses of what they're doing, and hoping that this video will be one of the catalysts for change. John and I have talked about this before. Just to give you a little background knowledge, I've known John for quite some time. I recently met Sarah not too long ago, and in talking with John, we felt this topic was important. So we've made movies before, or videos, and John has provided the English interpretation, voiceovers. And so most of my videos so far have had John's voice. But recently I did a project, and in our discussions, we figured we need a second person to do another voiceover for English interpretations. And when going into this, we found there was a really tough time finding a second interpreter, because in the industry, it seems that interpreters don't want to be rated or outed by other interpreters or a deaf person based on their voicing skills. And it's something I call an abject fear that these interpreters have. I mean, it's very profound. They have this profound fear. I'm not just talking, let's put the deaf community aside. Look, it's about the other interpreters. I've seen that in hearing interpreters. Hearing interpreters are not comfortable being rated by other interpreters, or asking a deaf person for feedback, asking how they might be able to improve in their interpreting. They have a profound fear. And my question is, why do they have this? So I thought, well, and then Sarah came along with her work, and she's doing all this stuff about this research about emotional intelligence. I thought it'd be appropriate to have that kind of skill and that knowledge so that we can have this chat and share some drinks. So first, let's have a toast. Great. So I've given us a topic, and now I'm wondering what you found in looking into this stuff, in this topic.
I think the first question we're going to have to ask people and ourselves is, what is fear? What's the purpose of fear? A type of emotion. I think that's number one. So how do we understand what it means and what purpose it has? Do you think a lot of people even think about that and understand that? I wonder.
It's a great point. So, John, did you want to add something?
I think I'll answer that from my not so scholarly point of view and see where it takes us. But my understanding is fear is really the thought that something negative will happen.
So you're alluding to the fight or flight response?
Down to. But let's say if someone walks up to me and they say, I want to talk about your shirt. I'm of one of two mindsets. I'm either quite proud of my shirt and I'm ready for them to ask me where I bought it, how much it was, or I'm uncomfortable and I'm afraid they're going to ask me or tell me it doesn't look good on me. So my mind is automatically going to go to one side or the other. And so depending on where I'm at, I may react with why? What's wrong? So it's really in that moment, fear is really the basic feeling that something negative will result from this situation, right?
Yeah, of course.
Not so sure
I
with
mean,
all
I
those
think it's
signals,
important
huh?
for all of us to understand fear. But what's interesting is based on research, fear is one of the first emotions that we develop for survival. You're right, it's that fight or flight. It's one of the first. And before it had a purpose. So let's say there was a lion out there and we were afraid and we'd run and we'd save our lives, right? So that was the purpose. But nowadays there's no lion out there. So what we're afraid of is we're afraid of failure or losing something. We're afraid of judgment. And so all of those type of things that now that we know that fear used to be mean that it was a threat for our lives is not necessarily a threat for our lives. We're not going to die anymore most of the time. So I think now things are changing in our perception of the situation. Is it a threat to our lives? Our bodies still feel the same regardless. We still feel our heart pounding. We want to run away. But we have to think, is this something that is in our head? Are they going to reject us or hate us? Or are we bad? Or are we not good enough? Is that all in our heads? Am I imagining that? Or is that
So
reality?
by the nature of your
And I
question,
think that's the big question.
so by the nature of your question, these ideations can become a jinx.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's natural. I think we all feel fear. And people start feeling fear. If it's unrecognized, then they'll run or they don't want to face it or they're unsure instead of just facing it and say, hey, I'm scared. Why am I feeling this way? And really digging down deep and saying, oh, okay, this is why I'm afraid. I'm afraid of not being good enough or that they're going to hate me. And then how do I approach and work through that feeling? I think most people naturally and unconsciously react to everything that's going around them. So if they're afraid, they're going to run instead of thinking it through.
But fear has some benefits.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's
I
right.
mean, if I'm going into a job and I'm afraid that I'm going to fail, I might take the time to research the topic, become better prepared.
Right.
So I have that instinct of that fear of failure, and I can respond by being really more motivated and more honest in my work and take steps to silence that voice of fear. I don't need to be afraid because I've done all of these things. I've taken these steps.
Yep. It's a push. So that's what I'm talking about. Exactly. It comes back to my original point. Why is there a high risk? What exactly makes it a high risk?
That reminds me, I interpreted a wedding 3, maybe 4 years ago. Oh, why are you laughing, Ryan? So during the wedding, I made a huge mistake. Okay, wait a minute.
John.
It wasn't during
I'm
the
giving you permission.
ceremony.
You can
They
share the
did
story.
actually get
It's
married.
okay.
It was
Go
legally
ahead.
binding. Okay, I was interpreting Ryan's wedding, and he,
Sort of.
in his speech, is
I
talking
don't really
to his
remember anymore. I
father-in-law,
think
who's a bit
I'm not really
right
sure
of
where his
center in
political stance is.
views.
But anyway, go ahead.
And Ryan, well, smart people
Just a little.
will do that, right? But anyways,
Oh,
Ryan,
way on the other side.
he's a little bit left of center, just a little bit. So anyone who knows both of them knows that they both have their eye on politics, and they both will assertively engage in conversations about politics, and they're open to discussion. So anyways,
closeted.
To get to the point, Ryan called
closeted
his father-in-law
liberal. Closeted
closet Democrat.
Liberal.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, right. Closet liberal. Right.
Wait, did I actually use liberal or Democrat? So long ago, I can't hardly remember.
Better.
Either word fits in context.
It was several years ago. I don't know. But someone does have this all recorded. So, anyways, I'm across the room. It's been a long day. And I missed his sign for closet. I thought he signed communist. So you see the phonemes just slightly different. So I said in English, his father-in-law was a communist liberal or Democrat, whatever word it was. And the whole room laughs. But I'm working with my sister, who is really a good interpreter, and she will bring your mistakes to your attention. She doesn't sugarcoat it, and she just walks over and says, "What's this sign?"
Yep, yes.
And so I said, "Well, ask."
Yeah, during the actual wedding,
Ryan. So we walk over, we engage in a
put the wedding on hold, and
end up needing to pause the
I
festivities.
told everyone about
guests.
what he had said.
This is during the reception, and so imagine this: at Ryan Commerson's wedding, he pauses the festivities to critique the interpreter, me. So, but
no, it was
there
funny.
are two things that came out of that. One, the mistake was not so horrendous that it messed anything up, right? It was fine. And two, the interpretation of the mistake was still funny. And
right.
It made people laugh.
That's a really good story.
More when we corrected it. So the following day or 2 days later, I don't know, I go back to work and I'm surrounded by other interpreters. And I'm telling my coworkers about the mistake I'd made at the wedding, and some interpreters were mortified. "Oh my God, are you okay? Were they mad?" And I'm like, that was probably the best part of the wedding for me, was the mistake happened. I had the chance to fix it. People laughed, and I'm not shaking in my boots. I'm not mortified. And Ryan wasn't, very upset that I made a mistake. It was a very open dialogue about that whole process. And there were other interpreters in the room, quite a few, many native language users. And the moment was not horrible for me. It was actually quite wonderful. And it's still, several years later, a funny story. But I realized then that interpreters are terrified of that particular moment, that someone taps you on the shoulder and says, that wasn't correct. And now I have to own the mistake. I have to correct it with the deaf person or the hearing person. I have to let them know I made a mistake. I need to correct it, fix it, repair it.
That's interesting.
Whatever. And that, I think, requires some conversation about why people are so afraid of that particular moment.
Can I ask you a quick question? So, and it relates. So if people feel afraid because of fear of rejection or not feeling accepted, do you feel like you're more, just because you socialize more with the deaf community, that you feel this bond, that one mistake isn't going to ruin your relationship with the deaf community? But let's say other interpreters who don't have a good relationship with the deaf community, that kind of relationship, one mistake, and they worry about what they're going to think of me. So maybe that's what it is. I'm just wondering, but there could be something to do with that.
Question,
I don't know.
I think that's valid. There's validity to that. John?
No, I'm just looking at your reaction. My mind is definitely wheeling anyways. When you look at Coakley's research about how interpreters emerged into the profession, they came into the community, trained by the deaf community, going back 50 years or whatever, and over time that has evolved. Deaf people are not the gatekeepers of training interpreters anymore. We know that. And we have some wonderful deaf people and some brilliant teachers of interpreters, trainers of interpreters who are deaf. But there are a lot of hearing interpreters. Many are not native language users. And some interpreter trainers are not linguistically qualified to teach language to the level of many people in the deaf community. I feel like I can safely, saying that is safe. But if students, when students are in a classroom, they don't get 100% eye contact with the teacher. Teacher has the most power in the room, right? That's, in that dynamic, the power dynamic is there with, the power lies with the teacher. So they engage with their peers, they practice their signing for 2 years, 4 years, whatever the program may be. And the deaf person is quite removed from that relationship with growth and development. And so the power person in that situation is missing. Students graduate, they become interpreters. And who's the person with power in that situation? Who can give the feedback? Deaf people in interpreting assignments, typically by nature of the job, deaf people don't have access to the source language to provide the feedback to the interpreter. That's just the nature of that work. They don't have access to both sets of information. So there's no one in that space to give that feedback. So you rely, say, maybe on your team or continued growth, continued exposure and mentorship. However, often people fresh out of programs don't have that, or it's not happening properly. So mentorship, we don't even know in our profession. We're trying to figure out what mentorship looks like. Why are you writing my name on that pad? Anyways, as interpreters, we're still trying to figure out what it means to mentor. How do we train post programs once we've become professionals? How do we enforce people following the rules? How do we respond or discipline if people don't follow the rules? We're still evolving the CPC and the Code of Ethics and looking at that situation. So really, often in our work, we have no oversight from anyone with access to both languages. And so how do interpreters get it? When do they get
That's very
feedback?
interesting.
And from who do they get
it's
feedback?
interesting. In my lifetime, I had either two experiences with interpreters. Either there's no relationship with them, or they go way over the boundary, except they're mothering me and taking care of me and telling me what to do. So those were the two extremes I experienced within that boundary. Like there was a thick median that we never crossed, or the interpreter jumped over the line.
Where do I fall?
John, we're like brothers. Come on.
Oh, right. No boundaries. Okay, got it.
With you, I think the two of us. Well, anyway, let's put that aside. But it's really interesting. You're right. And it's one of my frustrations. I want to have that be an equal ground with the interpreters, but it rarely happens. I can see it that they're always looking down at me. I see it. And so I want to be on the same playing field, level the playing field, and have the mutual respect. But that's kind of awkward. Secondly, I know that because of the VRS industry, that the number of interpreters has been growing. But it's getting through training and through jobs. But those people have not ever met a deaf person. And that's occurring more and more. Interpreters who have never actually met a deaf person.
Right, so it's othering,
So it's very interesting
right?
about what you said.
Pushing people out.
Just giving you my thoughts.
Sorry.
I can see...
Oh, no, I just wanted to add one.
Sarah, your gears are turning. So what would you want to add?
Right. No, well, I do think that it's interesting that Ryan just mentioned about feeling, especially with the different kind of interpreters and their attitudes. I remember a while back, it was Dave Justice who gave a presentation relating to social justice, and there was one thing that really stuck with me. he spoke about oppression, and it wasn't always downward. You typically see people look down on people and they feel oppressed, but it's not always that way. It could be upward oppression, saying, you are amazing. It's like fetishizing
Being put on
them.
a
Wow,
pedestal.
they're deaf. They're so cool. Yeah.
Interesting.
And that's oppression too, because you're not seeing that person as a person. So, and I know you've mentioned that idea before, and then it could be pressing out or pushing outwards. Those three things, those ways of being are still oppression. So for us to understand that other culture, which is really the point, it's how can we build that trust and build a mutual respect? And I think that that's for us, for us to take risks and to be open about making mistakes and not being in fear that if we make one mistake, they're going to reject me. I think that goes back to what John just mentioned. And you were talking about we need more mentors and we need more models. We need more people modeling that type of behavior, and we really do need that. But do we have trust yet built in our community yet? Or, as you notice, most of the community still is fearful of each other, and we still don't quite trust each other yet. So how do we build that first?
I'm very tempted to get into that, jumping to a solution, right? So it's there, it's in the chair, waiting to be revealed. The answer is there, it's waiting to be revealed. But I really want to say that, we all have this concept, we explain the fear, but I don't think in our discussion we've actually known why it is so serious. There are lots of different professions out there, but I think the interpreting community has one of the most irrational level of fear way over the line that affects their performance skills, and it affects the deaf community's feeling of trust to work with that interpreter.
And access.
Right. So, I think they're way overboard with that fear. And that's what I want to know about that. I want us to discuss a little bit more about what that fear is before we
ask you a question, Ryan.
Move on.
How often do you, after a VRS call or after an in-person appointment, how often do you take the time to engage with the interpreters about
Ever.
Never? Why?
Okay, I shouldn't say never, but it depends on who it is. Like for you, John, we always have these great discussions. We talk things through. We have this natural bond. But with most interpreters out there, with the job's over, we say goodbye, and we don't see each other until the next time we're working again.
I do understand, not to call myself a hearing interpreter, but as a hearing interpreter, to ask you for your time, to have you invest 10 minutes into my life, to give me feedback so I can be a better interpreter is a bit weird to ask that of you. However, if I go into any other service arena, McDonald's, Walmart, wherever, they have comment cards at the door that as a customer I can fill that out and say I'm unhappy with the service I received. And interpreters are one of the very few places you can work.
Where's that kind of
an opportunity?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Feedback.
We don't have anything like that.
Well, okay, never.
Completely agree with you. Yeah.
I know that there are some places.
I think we did have that. Do you remember? They started something like that, and people didn't want to do it.
Like rate your professor.
You guys remember that, right?
That what you're talking about? Yeah, yeah. I saw all that banter about that. Yeah.
People didn't want it.
There was that fear, and that's my point. There's the fear again.
Off the ground.
That's what I'm talking about.
Because, and I feel quite strongly about this, because interpreters do not trust feedback from peers.
Why?
Again, it goes back to that.
Really, we don't look at deaf people as our peers. They don't have access to both pieces of information. I understand both things that are being said. You don't. So how can you tell me and give me feedback? So we're not equals in that linguistic exchange. We're not equals. That's how interpreters view it. Unless I make you an equal.
So is that a dynamic of power?
Have power, right. I come in with the power. So if you have a job interview, I get there, I introduce myself. I could be a bit funny. I can be polite, I can be whatever, but I set the tone before they even interact with you. I've set the tone.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
so
That's true. Can't.
by showing up? We can't?
I have my immediate response, but I want to see your point, and then I'll give you my response. I'll just hold on to it before I give you my answer.
I could apologize. As an interpreter, I can apologize. I can say, I'm sorry, I have a bit of a strong personality. I come in, I make jokes to reduce the level of uncomfortability, but maybe I should not have done that. Here is Ryan, and this is Joe, and really humble myself in that room. But again, it goes back to having a conversation with the deaf person, and we, how do we do this? I can't ignore the fact that I'm human. I can't. I can't take the human me out of this situation. So how do I have the most minimal impact on this relationship?
That's exactly, yeah.
And
that's
first,
exactly. I wanted to talk about that. Yep.
I have to acknowledge that I have an impact on this relationship. And I don't want to say most, many come with the attitude that you're lucky I'm here, deaf person, and hearing person, you're going to pay me when I leave, so you're thanking me. And the deaf person, you're not going to thank me, or you might thank me. But how are either of you going to give me feedback if you don't know what the other one's talking about? So
Interesting.
The first time that I get feedback is when I take on jobs like interpreting your video, or interpreting at workshops or conferences, or interpreting in front of other interpreters. Those are rare opportunities. And also, many people in our profession don't want those kinds of jobs because it becomes an open world, and it exposes me to people
that's really interesting.
critiquing my work, and I want to keep it under lock and key.
And really never thought about it before, but now I've come to the realization that most interpreters are interpreting where there's no one else around.
Manager,
there's no oversight. There's no accountability. There's no one to check in the balance that everything's okay.
Where's the support?
You're at a conference
from the community,
or
that's right,
something's being recorded, or something where they're actually being something you work with a team and you actually have to take turns. Then the interpreters silently cursing to themselves because they feel like they've been exposed.
Am I good enough or not? Right? What's the bar? What's the bar to measure me?
It does come up where you're working with a team and you have a team interpreter.
Okay.
And that's where, I don't know, you haven't read it, Sarah, yet. Thank you, Ryan, for reading the article that I sent. But in that article, they talk about two things. Horizontal.
Nice job. Thank you.
So they talk about horizontal violence. And that phrase, from what I can find, is based in research from 1980, but it's related to the nursing profession. Yeah. And the peer relationships in nursing seem to be very similar.
Research that parallels with our field too. I agree.
Somewhere,
a lot.
Interpreters adopted that phrase of horizontal violence, and we see it come up often in our field. So like here in Michigan, there was an hearing interpreter interpreting for the governor, and that interpreter does, good work. You see them out. They're a professional interpreter. And M.Ed, Michigan Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, and Michigan Deaf Association wrote a letter together to, I think it went to the governor. I really didn't pay attention to that piece. But they asked that a CDI be brought in, a certified deaf interpreter, because what they said is the way this interpreter is interpreting is not accessible to monolingual deaf users, ASL users. I didn't read the letter, so exactly how it's framed, how strong it was, I don't know. I didn't see that. But that the discussion that came out of that was really interesting because often they use the word bullying and horizontal violence. Oh, and we eat our young.
You saw those phrases in there?
I saw all three of those phrases used when discussing
It's the same as an
situation in
article
the online
about the
dialogue.
nursing,
So, yep.
about the nurses.
Yep. I mean, I remember just kind of looking at it and seeing, where does that phrase horizontal violence come from and why? Horizontal is violence against peers. So this article and where this term originated, they're not talking about how patients see nurses. They're not talking about how doctors see nurses. They're not talking about the actual work of nurses. You know, if you poke someone in the vein and you miss their vein, that's easy to judge, right? It's easy to identify. But it's when it's how peers just really start to criticize and interact. And when you look at the two professions, nursing and interpreting, they have a lot of parallels. They're both female dominated, service industries, and other things that make them very similar. So
Makes me wonder.
I looked at that and thought,
That's interesting.
how do we get past or overcome the concept of horizontal violence and feedback are equated with each other? Because they mean two completely different things.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I agree. That's exactly what I was thinking first with feedback, along with understanding where we are. So if we're good or not good, how do we even know if we don't ask other people in our community? So if we feel hesitant and we don't want to go up to people, then we compare ourselves because we look at each other and we say, are they good? Then I'm bad. Or if I'm bad, they're good. It's very binary. So it's this competitive nature because because you're right, we don't have this community of feedback, of learning or interaction, not of competition, but more of support. Competition and fear, that's from limited resources.
Competition.
So we're feeling this scarcity mindset. We're scared. We don't have enough, and that breeds competition and fear.
Competition?
Really, it's run by fear.
Sparking
and
the fear, or triggering the fear in others?
I think partly. Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But I think part of that is that feeling because we don't know where we stand. We don't know where we are. We don't know if we're good or not. So we have to look at that other interpreter. And if we think if they're good, that means I'm bad because I just don't know how I can assess my work. And I'm still feeling unsure about myself. So I think that's one part. I think the other piece of this is that we just have to know ourselves. That's part of emotional intelligence. And I think it's so important. Before I can even ask somebody, if I could say, Ryan, do you mind giving me feedback? Do you mind looking at my work? I think even before I can even do that, I have to feel confident within myself first. Because if I feel scared or unsure, I won't even ask you. Because if you say something that's going to hurt my ego, I'm going to completely shut down. So we have to build strong people who are able to understand, yes, I'm feeling scared, and this is why I'm feeling scared, and working through that feeling. I think this is key before we can even expect, because you're right, let's say I expect people to go out, meet people, interact with our communities, but at first, I think we really need to allow people to understand themselves. I think it's vital. Another piece of that is empathy, which is emotional intelligence. So with empathy, it's understanding what the other person feels, what's the impact of my actions. And I think this is another part of this discussion.
I've had this long-held belief that the health of the interpreting community depends on the health of the deaf community.
Definitely. I would agree with that, yeah. I think it's definitely
You're asking why. So if the deaf community is not there, I'm just talking about interpreters. Deaf community developed the language of the world that's not part of the mainstream. The mainstream is the spoken language, and the deaf community has a signed language. So the interpreters rely on the deaf community. And if the deaf community is oppressed, if it's thought as less of, if their language is thought as to be less of, If their concept is
It's
thought the language be
interesting.
low, and that that deaf people aren't well thought of, or have knowledgeable, or are dumb, or all those other things that we've heard before, then that becomes a part of the idea of interpreting as well. Interpreting becomes
Right.
a
We'll
part of that
adopt that
feeling.
role as well. Yeah.
So for interpreting to improve, the deaf community has to improve as well. I can see, John, you're going to give another butt. Go ahead.
But to go along with that, often the wealth of interpreters comes from the oppression of the deaf community.
What do you mean exactly?
There's some power and control.
Yes,
right?
that. Exactly.
There's a bit of power and control, right? We as interpreters gain power from the dynamics of that relationship. I mean, sure, we'll say things like, I bridge the gap between communication. I'm there to facilitate communication, but the bottom line is deaf people need interpreters. That's the messaging. And that's our
right.
messaging. We're always telling people we don't have enough interpreters. We need more interpreters. But do we really? Is that actually the case?
We need more good interpreters. Yes.
We know that some deaf people, their demands aren't met. But why? Who's scheduling the work? Who's saying, you get an interpreter, but sorry, no one's available for this one? Who is the person? Is typically the coordinator at the interpreting agency.
Yeah, John. Yeah. Just a quick, just to answer that question. I think yes. I think we can always benefit from having more interpreters. I think it's a good thing.
Right.
If it's not one of those factory mill interpreters, So I think that, yeah, we do. I think we do. But it's how do we reframe this community? That's the part I'm interested in. And I think that's a really good point.
How do we reframe our needs as a deaf community, to say we need more good interpreters? And if some of you retired today, that'd be okay by us.
Right.
But because we know that there are interpreters accepting work that they're not qualified for. We see it on TV. We saw it in Oklahoma a couple months ago. So when you look at these high-profile jobs, they're often happening in different states and different areas. And if we're seeing it, think about the opportunities that we don't see it, where people are unqualified for the work.
So that leads to the connection with the deaf community.
Profiting from the situation.
Remember before we were talking about powers, about interpreters figuring out how to give back the power. And my answer is that you can't give power. The community has to realize their own power. They have the power to ask for a specific interpreter they've already worked with in the past. That's an example. They have the power to build distrust and get a mutual understanding. If we understand our signs, and I trust the word choices you're using. And you are, in your word choices, you're representing who I am. And you can say that you don't want one person, but you want another. And it's not meant to make anyone feel bad. It's just that I have a relationship, or you have this good rapport with this interpreter you don't have with another. And so it's up to the deaf person to look at what the interpreter is doing and see if you can talk it over. And that's where that trust is coming in. To be the one to be able to break the news, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, that fear is not only with interpreters, right? It's on both sides. I'm sure the deaf community has fear too.
Exactly.
So what if the interpreter is like, oh, I can't believe you told me this.
I can't say anything.
Wanting to work with you. That's my access for communication. So what am I going to do then?
So it's not just on the interpreter side. It's part of the deaf interpreter side to have
that mutual respect.
an awareness of myself be able to build that trust, being able to level the playing field. And be able to be a part of that power dynamic. So if an interpreter tries to take care of all the business, the deaf person can come in and say, no, it's my business. I can do it myself. And so the deaf person can say that the interpreter is there to make sure that there's access communication, that things are understood, and saying that might be their job. And of course, the interpreter may feel like this is a personal affront. So it goes both ways.
100%. When you think about how a deaf person like you gets trained by interpreters, right? So you started in elementary school. Families learning to sign, but they're not native users. So you're learning sign language from, like, who originally taught you how to sign? Family, but who else? Did you have someone come and work with your
My family learned sign from a deaf family. Another deaf family.
Okay, deaf family. Okay, and then you started school.
Yes, I was exposed to sign through an interpreter.
Education, elementary school.
Yeah, interpreter and my teachers.
Right. So, you started with interpreters at the age of 3-4 years old. And so at that age, are you going to correct the interpreter or say, hey, you're having a bad day. Look at your attitude. You need more coffee. You're not going to have
that self-awareness, right? The social skills, you just don't have that. There's so many things involved in this.
Exactly. And we also know
there's so many things
where you find new interpreters, young interpreters, is in the elementary education setting, because they're getting no feedback. You know, if the student criticizes them, they might have a consequence for that. They might go on timeout. So that's where we really, as interpreters, we start training deaf people to just don't say anything. Don't challenge the interpreter. And when you are quiet and you don't challenge the interpreter, and the interpreter tells you, good job, you feel great. So we perpetuate that into adulthood. And when they go to college in a mainstream setting, they're getting their master's in science. Who's checking the clock to see if the interpreter's late? Or who's saying, teach me how to sign this word in this scientific technical term? Like, you have to look at that lifelong oppressive dynamics where oppression starts young. And
that's right. And if not, what we do is you just repeat that cycle over and over again. And how many years have we done this? We've had the same thing. People have been complaining since I've worked as an interpreter, and I've seen this for longer. It's just the same thing. We have to break that cycle from happening, and the question is how. But you're right. I think that, John, you're right. You know, you got to think the deaf community really do have to understand who they are, and the interpreting community needs to understand who they are too. And I think that's huge as well. It's not just this, we're dependent on each other, we're looking at each other to validate us. We got to know our own skills for interpreters. Focus on socialization, involving yourself in the deaf community, but improving your language. Focus on developing your own feelings of confidence with your work. I think that's a huge piece in all this. Once we start uplifting ourselves, we can earn the trust from the deaf community, because they'll look at interpreters and say, wow, they're really invested in their jobs. Wow, and they'll start feeling more confident in our work. So I think it does work both ways.
Yeah, it's both for both groups.
Exactly. Both groups, we both gain this self-awareness and understanding, knowing the reasons why we're here working together. What is our purpose? And not being fearful, but acting on our purpose. So it's really important to understand that, understand ourselves. And then when we start working with each other, we'll start feeling more confident. I think that's key. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree completely with that.
I don't know.
In my field, I've learned that we all can design and create a culture. It's possible. People do it all the time. And I'll give you a perfect example. Trump has designed and created a culture of hatred, of misinformation. And it's purposeful. And it shows his power. So the deaf the interpreting community and the deaf community can make a culture of exchanging ideas. We can create a, I don't know what you want to call it, a movement or a trend. Some kind of new expectations, I guess. So when you walk into a room and you don't know each other, you take that opportunity prior to the interpreting to get to know each other. The purpose of why we're here, what the assignment actually entails. Have that conversation, or whatever, something like that. But you can then set up an equal power dynamic and be on the same level for the goal. Right, exactly.
I know I have
Getting rid of the fear,
and I still
is
want
by
to move
coming
forward
up
in
with
it
those
regardless.
expectations. Mm-hmm.
Because I have to. I have to up my game in a way. You just have to.
That means I can expect constructive criticism prior or after the interpreting event. Figuring if we actually met the goal of the meeting, or like a conference. So you do that before. And then afterwards, you have time to debrief and say, well, I wish something like this would happen. And then you can have a discussion as to why you wanted that to happen. And within that idea, that culture may seem to could spread. What do you think? Your eyebrows look furrowed, John.
Well, I think that interpreters have to first give up their power.
No.
What'd you say again?
They have to
They need to do what?
relinquish. They have to give up their power.
No, I'm not saying anything about giving up. I'm not sure that's how power works.
They need to
There's always
can abdicate.
There's
the
always
throne.
people who have power. You have your power.
It's interesting.
Each person is an agent of power. They recognize. You have to recognize what each party has in terms of power. Deaf people have the power to spread rumors about an interpreter, when then the interpreter will never get work again. So interpreters can figure out that they have the power because they hold information that two other parties may not recognize.
It's negotiated.
I don't think there's any power to be given up. Basically, that's right. Yeah, it's about negotiation. I'm sorry, John. Go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just thinking and reflecting on my experience typically when an interpreter comes in the room and the hearing professional comes in, whether it's the nurse, doctor, lawyer, whatever, they typically come in the room and give the power to the interpreter immediately.
Give or recognize?
They will look at the interpreter.
Acknowledge, recognize it.
It is very rare for a doctor to come into the room and immediately initiate conversation with the deaf patient. And when they do, it's typically because they've been redirected by an interpreter that says, when you come in, you don't need to acknowledge me, you're talking to the interpreter. Now, obviously, sometimes the service relationship is based on history, experience, if this doctor has used interpreters in the past. And if they have, sometimes they'll come in and say, good morning, and then start the conversation with the deaf person. So they're really just acknowledging that I'm there, but not giving me power. But it's on us as interpreters to say, you need to talk to the deaf person. I mean, yes, you can email
I have a question. Can a deaf person do that too?
And I will have a conversation with you after. So, for example,
I think that's how I feel.
Appointment's done, deaf person leaves, I go home. I can follow up with the doctor and make sure that they were satisfied with my services in the appointment. That can happen post-appointment, and it does happen. I mean, maybe not necessarily with doctors, but whatever professional environment you're in, there can be that feedback,
Sarah,
right? It does happen.
I think you had a question?
Oh, I just feel, is that an interpreter's role for us to say, can you look at the deaf person, or can a deaf person just do that as well? They can see what's going on. If they feel a certain way, they could do that. So we could just let them say, hey, can you look at me? And that's it.
But often as interpreters, we require deaf people to do A, B, C, and D before we relinquish power. I'm not sure that it's fair to acknowledge the historical oppression of deaf people and then ask them to do more.
I would stand up if I needed someone to pay attention to me. Again, I think that relates to self-awareness and my ability to set boundaries and expectations for other people. I think if we with any kind of relationship dynamic. And if we take away that opportunity, then we're also taking away their opportunity to understand themselves and how to act moving forward, to set boundaries and expectations with other people. Again, I think it goes back to Ryan's point of the deaf community. Again, that awareness of what that means is of boundaries, self-awareness. It goes back to that. And I think there are a lot of things that have to happen. But I think ultimately it's going to be important. It is important to let that person take ownership and really reclaim, understand that they have it, that they can use it, you know?
Interpreters tend to hear about Deaf Night Out, and they will show up for observation hours. And we know one of the most basic human needs is to have social interaction with others. We know that. I acknowledge that. And so deaf people are there with their peers, and students show up and say, hey, you signed my paper? And we watch a conversation, I catch one word and jump in and say, do you mind? My name is, and we see that students insert themselves in that space. And deaf people are starting to avoid attending events where interpreting students will be. And so how do we redefine the boundary of what is deaf community, where is deaf community, what is deaf space, and when and where should interpreting students show up, and how do we respect that line?
Yes.
And I know there's no easy answer.
We just opened a can of worms.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, one of the most intimate spaces in the world for many people is church,
community,
or religion,
right.
You're getting at the your innermost being, at your spiritual needs. And for deaf people who can't interact at work with their co-workers, or they can't at the gas station have a conversation with someone in line, the church becomes like their deaf club. However, interpreting students are told repeatedly, go to churches with deaf ministries and observe. You know, it's ironic. I have a fishbowl right here, so I know what I'm talking about. So I think I've become an expert in fishbowls now at this point, looking at it right here. But how do we redefine what community is, and how interpreting students insert themselves?
John, I just one question, and we can open it up for discussion. I think, yes, the point is building authentic and relationships, right? It's those authentic relationships. Where we could be open and saying, we're here, we want to build a relationship with other people. I feel that's what it is. Signing a paper, that doesn't mean I care about you, right? So I think it's important to show it through actions.
It actually means
my
the opposite.
time invested. It doesn't have to be everyone in the deaf community, but if I show that I'm invested with 1, 2, 3 people, I learn by acting. I'm crossing out of my comfort zone, working through my fear. I think that's key, especially with newer interpreters who have never met a deaf person and they're feeling scared and they're like, okay, can you sign this? And that's it. Or how do you sign? Or someone's asking them, how are you? And they're like, I'm fine. And they don't want to say anything else. Working through that fear and just saying, how can I just go and just be human? Yeah,
but that really ties into,
in a big
it goes
way,
back
yes,
to emotional intelligence,
working
right?
through the fear, that's right. So again, it's understanding yourself.
Yeah. So how do we set that aside?
So, interesting about this topic. I was having a conversation with another CDI. He had been doing some training.
And
I'm not saying who it is. I haven't asked this person to see. I haven't asked this person if I can release his name yet.
We didn't get a confidentiality. They didn't sign a confidentiality agreement. Next time, we're just going to have to get them here.
Right. I'll have to ask him if he doesn't mind. I'll have to ask
just
him,
tell me.
and
I
then
won't tell anybody
see if I can
else.
actually tell him his name. Then I can
so
drop
bad.
in his name.
Drink.
Just tell me. Just
John.
Just tell me.
Love you.
Don't worry, Sarah. I'll fill you.
So anyway, in our conversation, he had said that there are really two great churches he talked about. He noticed that Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and in Jehovah's Witnesses. In those two branches of religion, the hearing people who get involved with the deaf ministry are phenomenal signers. Their signing skills are out of this world.
Oh, I don't think it's for some reason. I think we can
Why?
exactly pinpoint
Go ahead.
the reason. We know what the reason is. Because both of those churches require that you're rooted and connected in community.
And how do they do that? Exactly.
You live
Precisely.
in the community. Yep. You live with the community. And those, I call them interpreting students, but whether they call themselves missionaries or whatever, they require that you come in with the mindset of, I need you. It's not you as a deaf person need me. You're lucky I'm here. You're lucky I'm on time. I didn't wear the right shirt, but oh well, too bad. There's none of that. They come in with the mindset of, I need
Right,
you.
exactly.
Can
That's
I
exactly it.
really
And
help
that,
into your life for the
my
next 3
point,
months?
they live together with a deaf community, deaf family in an intimate environment. So,
No, go ahead.
you're laughing.
I
You
want to see
wanna
the point
jump
you're
in.
making.
Okay.
So go ahead.
thought you were going to add something. Okay,
Keep all
so
my facial expressions down a little bit. I'm sorry. I'm going to control myself.
great. So, right, in those two people who want to become in deaf ministry, is required to, if you want to become in the ministry for the deaf, you have to live with a deaf family. That means you get up in the morning with your bedhead and you see their slurring conversation before they get their coffee. Those hearing people are exposed to that everyday intimate level of signing, the whole range of signing. They see it as people. I'm not saying one religion is better than the other. What I'm talking about is exposure. They see the exposure every day. And I think that gives us a clue as to how we can restructure the interpreting profession. How we can make changes to the interpreting profession. There are things we probably can take from what they're doing and apply it to the interpreting field.
I completely agree. I remember a few years ago, the travel abroad program. Where's a deaf country that there's all deaf people at? You can't do that. But can we have host families? I know there's a lot of people. I remember they mentioned that. I haven't seen it happen yet, but I think that would be great. And another interesting fact I know that relates to emotional intelligence is that emotional recognition piece. It's a huge part of interpreting that I think a lot of people, we just don't teach it yet. We will, hopefully. But it's how do we recognize someone's emotions and in-group emotions display from people from different cultures. And people from different cultures have the same type of emotions, these basic emotions. But how do we perceive, show, display, interpret is all different based on their culture. So some cultures show more emotions, some express less emotions. And so what it means when you're part of the in-group is that you're actually in that group. You're socializing. You're spending time with that community. So if there's a little bit of an emotional display, you'll catch that. But if you're not hanging out with that group, you're not within that group, you have a less of an understanding of what it means, those undertones, that affect, the subtext, you'll miss all that information. And I feel that's a huge detriment for so many interpreters. Plus, if you're talking about different races and cultures and people from different backgrounds, most interpreters, honestly, now are white females. They're hearing, not involved in different communities. So much of this is overlooked. And so many of these cultural meanings, nuances, emotional displays are missed. So what that means is we all have to step outside of our comfort zone and get into different communities. We have to for our profession. That's just it's a huge responsibility. But again, what that goes back to is understanding ourselves. If we feel afraid, we feel safe in our own culture and communities, stepping out is sometimes hard. And we feel unsure about that. But we have to do that knowing that we will make mistakes. So, and that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. Those mistakes won't kill us. And so once we make a mistake, even if we're afraid, we make those mistakes, we see that we're fine, and we start doing that over and over again, and it becomes more comfortable dealing with the unknown. So I think you made a good point.
I have something I was thinking about, but John, you look very pensive. Do you want to say something?
Oh, I'd prefer to see your thoughts.
No, not at all.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean
no,
to stop
no.
this conversation.
I think you're moving
I'm
it.
sorry.
I think you're moving it.
Do we need to drink more? What?
No, you broke it, obviously.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking over there.
What? John?
Happening. I'm like, what? What's happening? Tell me. Something's happening.
I will
Is
not
she bringing ice cream?
interpret what happened there.
Shit.
Maybe.
I know, right?
No. We're just talking about
I
food,
need to know
and
what's
my
up.
food's ready. So they're preparing my food for me.
It's, must A to Z.
Oh, right. No, you don't.
Oh.
Same here, actually. My son has an 8:00 math party. Nowadays,
right.
got double, triple the job responsibilities. So
So you have to go soon, huh?
at 8:00, well, 8:30, I have to do a
Okay,
math
then I
quote
guess
unquote
it's time
party with my
for-
son.
to wrap things up.
Yeah, in 10 minutes. Yeah, we're gonna have a party. We're gonna get
Sarah,
ready, get
I
a
agree
decorate.
exactly what you said.
All right.
So I think for interpreting to improve, the ITP, whatever training is out there needs to be that living with a family built in to the program. And I know that will change the field. The foundation, and it'll change the culture. Just what we talked about earlier about changing the culture. And that will come from that approach. And from there, we'll spread out. It'll set the stage for improvement in interpreting. Now, the deaf community, I think what they can do is, well, I find it interesting that if you look at any deaf school, residential school, or mainstream program, they never offer any class of interpreting to deaf
Right.
kids. And I find that kind of amazing. As an example, I was teaching at a community college. I was teaching sign to a class to 30 students, kids. Well, not kids, students, and they were all hearing. And as I was signing, I realized that was the first time I actually had to work with the interpreter. Prior to that, I was always just a consumer. That is, I took everything in. I was in a passive position. But I didn't understand the idea of interpreting or what the process of interpreting was. I had no clue until the interpreter I was working with told me that person needed time to work things out. And then we had to negotiate that playing field. And afterwards, I took a course on CDI training. And what an eye-opener that was. I had no idea how much brain power and how much the process was about that. I didn't know anything about the process until my 20s or late 20s or early 30s. So why can't kids know about that when they're young? They need to know about that process. Don't wait until they're older or wait until they never learn. They should be able to learn about how the interpreting process works between American Sign Language and English. They can learn about the difference between simultaneous interpreting and consecutive interpreting. Deaf kids don't know about the difference, that there's two kinds. If they learn about the power dynamics, the code of professional conduct, the brain processes, if they learned all that, then when they see an interpreter, they can have the respect that it is an interpreter, and they say, yeah, I know to work with you. I understand your game. Deaf kids and deaf adults really don't know how to improve. How are they able to give feedback and support the interpreter is hoping to get, but they never get because
That's right.
we don't know, we are not talking the same language. And so I think that in deaf education, whether it be at a residential school or
That makes sense.
mainstream setting, CDI, or someone needs to teach about interpreting. So we recognize that power, and the kids can then recognize the power of the interpreters, and that way we can negotiate and be on the same playing field.
Love
Yes.
it. Yeah, I love it.
Absolutely. John?
Yes.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Interpreters have taught that class for many years. Hearing interpreters have been teaching
okay.
that for years. Unfortunately, not in the right way. I think you do need a deaf person, a CDI, deaf association, deaf hood, deaf schools. I think you need to tap into those resources for it to be presented in a way that it's not a hearing person again telling you what to do what I say, but really teaching deaf people how to capitalize on the skills of interpreters to accomplish what they want.
It was
I think
choppy
we
on
need
my
a deaf
end.
person
I
to
missed some of
teach
that. I'm
deaf
sorry.
students on how to capitalize
Survival
on the
skills.
of interpreters to get what they want and need.
You're talking about survival
How to
skills.
negotiate,
Right.
how to
Healthy,
navigate.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Exactly.
Right. It's that human. We set up healthy
Right.
relationships
Sarah, do you have
and not
any
unhealthy
closing remarks to wrap
relationships.
things
That's
up?
Yeah, that's right. This has been really fascinating on so many levels. And we've covered so many topics here. It's been wow, I'm just feeling like each one of the things that we talked about, they are all interrelated. And it goes back to understanding ourselves more for anyone, for interpreters in the deaf community. I think we can have huge impacts from what, both John and Ryan said. We want to do good. We want to succeed. But first we have to understand ourselves. Who am I? It goes back to that question. Do I have value? Can I take risks? Do I want to improve? Do I feel scared? Can I even notice how I feel? And if we understand this, we understand there's a lot of different feelings. So one way to do this is start by checking in. When I go into these situations, how am I feeling? I think that's just if we do this video now, right, for interpreting that's a huge scale. But just to take it back to each of us, how do I feel during this situation when I work with this other interpreter? How am I feeling when I work with a certain person? How do I feel? What's causing me to have this mental block when I'm working, or what causes me to do really well at my work?
Self-awareness.
So really journaling, writing that down, thinking about that causes us to know ourselves better. And I hope we start talking about this stuff more often.
I suspect we will have further conversation. I suspect we will.
Hold on, what'd you say? Why?
Because it's
What?
not done.
Again,
And I think we've already
part 2.
Oh,
that
right,
this
right.
will
Yeah,
continue to come
yes.
up, this topic.
Yes.
Part 2, part 5.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
it'll continue to happen.
Oh, I'm sure
I think
it'll
it's
keep
really
going,
overrated.
right?
Right.
Until
We'll
we're
still be
we're
talking
old.
about it then. I think it's all goes back to what Sarah said about authentic relationships. How do interpreters have authentic relationships? We get paid every time a deaf person needs an interpreter. We get paid. So how do we create authentic relationships when we're getting paid? How do we recognize that? How do we recognize our own emotional intelligence? And how do we negotiate and navigate the relationship so that as a professional, obviously I still want to get paid, but how do I do that and maintain a healthy relationship with the deaf community where there's mutual respect?
Like that.
Great. Well, let's wrap things up here.
That could be our next topic.
Yes, I enjoy talking to you two tonight. Thank you for joining and thank you for sharing. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, you too. All right, thanks for
Take care.
this. I loved it. All right, good night. Bye.